June 12, 1944, near Bayeux, Normandy, General Lieutenant Wilhelm Ritter von Schlieben was receiving reports from German reconnaissance units monitoring the Allied bridgehead. The reports were strange. Only 6 days had passed since the D-Day landings. The beaches were still crowded with men, vehicles, and supplies. Fierce fighting continued across the Norman countryside. Yet, Allied fighter aircraft were already appearing over the battlefield with remarkable frequency. The question was simple. Where were they coming from? German planners knew the major Allied airfields in southern England. They understood the enormous effort required to construct permanent military air bases. Runways required engineering surveys, heavy equipment, construction materials, maintenance facilities, fuel storage, communication systems, and support infrastructure. Such projects took time, but reconnaissance reports suggested something unexpected. Allied aircraft were now operating from locations inside Normandy itself, locations where no military airfields had existed before the invasion. To many German engineers and staff officers, the situation seemed almost impossible. The Allies had not merely landed armies, they appeared to be bringing entire air bases with them. Within days, fighter groups were flying from newly established landing grounds close to the front lines. As Allied forces advanced across France, these airfields seemed to advance with them. Fields became runways, pastures became operational bases, aircraft landed, refueled, rearmed, and launched missions from places that had recently been farmland. What German observers were witnessing was one of the most important but least celebrated innovations of the war. The story was not about a single aircraft or weapon, it was about engineering. Behind every Allied fighter overhead stood specialized construction battalions, prefabricated runway materials, logistical planning, and industrial production on an extraordinary scale. The Germans saw airplanes. What they did not immediately see was the system that allowed entire airfields to appear almost overnight. To understand why German engineers were shocked by America's portable airfields, we must first examine the reports that convinced many of them they were witnessing something entirely new. In the days following the Normandy landings, German commanders faced a growing problem. Allied aircraft seemed to be everywhere. Fighter bombers attacked roads, bridges, rail lines, troop columns, and supply convoys throughout northern France. German units attempting to move during daylight often found themselves under constant observation from the air. The sheer volume of Allied air activity raised an obvious question for intelligence officers trying to understand the situation. How were so many aircraft operating so close to the front? Initially, German planners assumed most sorties were still being launched from England. The Royal Air Force and the U.S. Army Air Forces possessed extensive airfield networks across southern Britain. However, as operations continued, reconnaissance reports began suggesting something unexpected. New airfields were appearing inside the Allied bridgehead. One of the earliest examples was Advanced Landing Ground B3 at Saint-Croix-sur-Mer, completed only days after D-Day. Soon, additional landing grounds followed across Normandy. Areas that had recently been agricultural fields were transformed into functioning military air bases capable of supporting combat operations. To German observers, the speed was astonishing. Traditional military airfields required extensive preparation. Construction normally involved surveying terrain, preparing foundations, installing infrastructure, and creating facilities capable of supporting aircraft operations. Such projects often took weeks or months. The Allies seemed to be accomplishing similar results in a fraction of the time. German reconnaissance aircraft photographed newly established airstrips that had not existed only days earlier. Ground reports confirmed the presence of Allied fighters operating from locations far closer to the battlefield than expected. Every new airfield shortened flight times and increased the number of missions Allied aircraft could fly each day. The implications were serious. Aircraft launching from Normandy could spend more time over targets, and less time traveling to them. Fighter bombers could respond more quickly to requests from ground forces. Air superiority became even harder for the Luftwaffe to challenge. For German engineers examining the problem, the mystery was becoming impossible to ignore. These were not conventional airfields. The Allies had found a way to make air power mobile, and the secret behind that capability lay in a remarkable set of engineering innovations that could turn open countryside into an operational runway almost overnight. The answer to the mystery was not hidden in the aircraft, it was hidden beneath their wheels. For decades, military planners had understood that airfields were essential. The problem was that traditional runways required enormous amounts of time and labor to construct. Soft ground, mud, rain, and heavy aircraft could quickly render a newly captured field unusable. The Allies approached the problem differently. Instead of building permanent airfields first, and then moving aircraft onto them, they developed systems that allowed runways themselves to be transported into combat zones. One of the earliest solutions was Sommerfeld tracking, a wire mesh surface reinforced with steel rods. Originally developed in Britain, it could be rolled out across prepared ground to create usable landing surfaces. Other systems followed, including square mesh track and prefabricated runway materials specifically designed for rapid deployment. But the most famous innovation was pierced steel planking, often called PSP. PSP consisted of interlocking steel panels with holes punched throughout the surface to reduce weight and improve drainage. Individual sections could be transported by truck, unloaded by engineering units, and assembled into runways capable of supporting heavy military aircraft. The system was remarkably practical. Damaged sections could be replaced. Additional runway length could be added when necessary. Airfields could be expanded as operations grew. What once required months of construction could now be achieved in days. Engineering battalions became highly skilled at preparing ground, laying track, installing drainage systems, and creating operational landing strips under combat conditions. Many projects continued while artillery fire could still be heard in the distance. To German engineers, the concept was revolutionary. The Allies had effectively transformed the runway into a portable component of military operations. Instead of waiting for infrastructure to catch up with the army, infrastructure moved with the army. This innovation alone was impressive, yet portable runway materials were only part of the story. The real achievement was the organization that brought these materials to the battlefield, assembled them, maintained them, and kept them functioning under wartime conditions. That responsibility belonged to a specialized force built specifically for this purpose. Portable runway materials were impressive, but steel planking stacked in a warehouse could not win a war. The true strength of the Allied system came from the thousands of men trained to transform those materials into functioning airfields under combat conditions. Long before the Normandy invasion, the United States Army recognized that modern air operations would require specialized engineering forces. As a result, aviation engineer battalions were expanded and trained specifically to construct, repair, and maintain airfields close to the front lines. These units were unlike traditional construction organizations. Their mission was not to build permanent civilian airports. Their mission was to move with advancing armies and create operational bases wherever they were needed. Engineers learned how to survey terrain, operate heavy equipment, establish drainage systems, prepare runway foundations, and install prefabricated landing surfaces under difficult conditions. When Allied forces landed in Normandy, these battalions arrived with them, often working around the clock. Engineers cleared obstacles, leveled ground, filled craters, and assembled runway materials. Bulldozers, graders, trucks, and construction equipment became as important to the air campaign as fighters and bombers. The speed of their work was remarkable. Within days of the invasion, advanced landing grounds were already supporting combat operations. As Allied forces pushed deeper into France, engineering units repeated the process again and again. Airfields appeared near newly captured territory, allowing Allied aircraft to relocate closer to the front. The system required far more than engineers alone. Fuel had to be delivered. Ammunition stocks had to be maintained. Communications equipment had to be installed. Maintenance crews needed facilities to service aircraft. Air traffic control, weather reporting, security, and logistics all had to function together. In effect, the Allies were not simply building runways, they were creating complete air bases from scratch. To German observers, the results seemed extraordinary. Air power no longer depended on fixed infrastructure, far behind the front lines. It advanced alongside the army itself. And that mobility would soon produce one of the most important advantages of the entire campaign in Western Europe. Once Allied aircraft began operating from advanced landing grounds in Normandy, the nature of the air war started to change. Distance had always been one of the greatest limitations on air power. Aircraft launching from England had to spend valuable time crossing the English Channel before reaching targets in France. Fuel consumed during transit reduced the amount available for combat operations. Every mile flown to and from a target was a mile that could not be spent supporting troops on the ground. Portable airfields changed that equation. By moving fighter groups closer to the battlefield, the Allies dramatically increased operational efficiency. Aircraft could reach targets faster, remain over combat areas longer, and fly more sorties each day. A fighter bomber that once spent much of its mission simply traveling could now devote far more time to attacking enemy positions. German forces quickly felt the consequences. Columns moving along roads during daylight became increasingly vulnerable. Rail networks faced constant attack. Bridges, fuel dumps, headquarters, and troop concentrations were subjected to frequent airstrikes. Luftwaffe units attempting to operate near the front found themselves facing Allied fighters that could launch from airfields only minutes away. The effect was especially noticeable during the Allied breakout from Normandy. As American forces advanced during Operation Cobra in July 1944, engineering units constructed new airfields behind the advancing front. Fighter groups relocated forward, maintaining close contact with ground operations. The air support system effectively moved with the army. This created a powerful cycle. Ground victories produced new airfields. New airfields increased air support. Increased air support helped produce further ground victories. German commanders repeatedly reported the difficulty of moving troops and supplies under these conditions. Many units could operate more safely at night than during daylight, a testament to Allied air superiority. To German engineers studying the situation, the significance became increasingly clear. The portable airfield was not simply a construction project. It was a force multiplier that allowed Allied air power to remain continuously connected to the advance across Europe. Yet even this remarkable capability depended on one final advantage, an industrial and logistical system capable of producing and transporting vast quantities of materials wherever they were needed. By 1944, German engineers understood how the Allied portable airfields worked. What they struggled to understand was how the Allies could build so many of them. Every advanced landing ground required enormous quantities of material. Steel planking had to be manufactured, transported across the Atlantic, unloaded in Europe, moved to construction sites, and assembled by engineering units. Heavy machinery, fuel, spare parts, communications equipment, and maintenance supplies all had to arrive at exactly the right place and time. The scale of the operation was staggering. The United States had transformed its industrial economy into a wartime production machine capable of supplying military forces across multiple continents simultaneously. Factories produced not only aircraft and tanks but also the infrastructure needed to support them. Thousands of tons of pierced steel planking were manufactured and shipped overseas as part of a larger logistical network that stretched from American factories to European battlefields. The Allies enjoyed another advantage. Control of the sea allowed supplies to move in enormous quantities. Cargo ships carried engineering materials alongside vehicles, fuel, ammunition, and replacement equipment. Once in Europe, transportation networks moved those resources to advancing armies. Germany faced a very different situation. By the final years of the war, Allied bombing campaigns increasingly targeted rail systems, industrial facilities, and transportation hubs. Shortages of fuel, raw materials, and construction resources became more severe. Even when German engineers developed innovative solutions, the logistical system needed to implement them often struggled under mounting pressure. This widening gap affected every aspect of military operations. The Allies could build new airfields as they advanced. The Germans increasingly fought to maintain existing infrastructure. Allied engineers expanded operational capabilities. German planners focused on preserving diminishing resources. For German officers observing the Allied advance, portable airfields became a visible symbol of a much larger reality. They represented an opponent whose engineering, logistics, transportation, and industrial systems worked together on a scale that Germany could no longer match. The runways appearing across France were impressive, but they were merely the visible surface of something far larger, a system that helped redefine modern warfare. When German engineers first encountered Allied portable airfields in Normandy, many viewed them as an impressive technical innovation. By the end of the campaign, it had become clear that they were much more than that. The temporary runways spreading across France were not isolated engineering projects. They were part of a larger system that combined industrial production, logistics, planning, transportation, and specialized military training into a single operational advantage. Every advanced landing ground shortened the distance between Allied aircraft and the battlefield. Every new runway increased the number of sorties that could be flown. Every engineering battalion helped ensure that air power remained closely linked to advancing ground forces. The result was a level of mobility that few military planners had previously imagined. The Allies no longer had to wait for permanent infrastructure to catch up with military operations. Instead, they carried the infrastructure with them. Airfields could appear where they were needed, when they were needed, allowing fighters, reconnaissance aircraft, and fighter bombers to remain continuously engaged in the campaign. For Germany, the challenge was profound. The Luftwaffe was already struggling against overwhelming Allied air superiority. Portable airfields made that superiority even more difficult to challenge by ensuring that Allied aircraft could stay close to the front and respond rapidly to changing conditions. In the end, the story of America's portable airfields is not simply a story about steel planking or construction techniques. It is a story about systems. The aircraft may have dominated the skies, but it was the engineers, logisticians, planners, and workers behind them who made that dominance possible. The runways advanced with the army, and in many ways, they helped carry the Allied advance all the way across Europe.